My husband found out I was pregnant and left for his mistress. He emptied our bank account and said, "Good luck. You mean nothing to me anymore." But I just smiled. By the time he found out what I had done a month ago, it was already too late. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video, and also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me what the moment felt like. The moment my life split in two, clean as a bone. They want drama. They want tears. They want me to say I collapsed on the kitchen floor and couldn't breathe. But the truth is stranger than that. When it finally happened, when Daniel stood in our kitchen doorway and said the words that were supposed to destroy me, I smiled. And that smile, that quiet, steady smile, was the thing that frightened him most. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Before all of it, there was a life that looked, from the outside, exactly the way a life is supposed to look. Daniel and I had been married for 9 years. We lived in a house in Naperville, Illinois, a 4-bedroom colonial with a kitchen. I had renovated myself, room by room, choice by choice. I was 36. I was a financial analyst at a mid-sized firm downtown, and I was good at my job in the particular way that quiet, detail-oriented women are good at things. Invisibly, thoroughly, without fanfare. Daniel was a civil engineer. We had 2 cars, a savings account, a dog named Chester, and the kind of routines that feel like love until they don't. I had wanted a baby for 3 years. Daniel kept saying he wasn't ready. "Not yet," he'd say, refilling his coffee, not looking at me. "Give it another year." And I would nod because I was the kind of woman who nodded, who waited, who trusted that the man sleeping beside her was the man she believed him to be. The first sign came in March. It wasn't dramatic. It was a receipt, a hotel receipt to be specific, that fell out of the pocket of his gray jacket when I was sorting laundry. The Marriott on Michigan Avenue, a Tuesday night. Daniel had told me he was in Cincinnati for a work conference that week. I stood in the laundry room for a long time, holding that small piece of paper, listening to the hum of the washing machine. I didn't confront him. Not then. I'd like to say it was strategy, and eventually it became that. But at first, it was simply disbelief. I put the receipt back in the pocket. I finished the laundry. I made dinner, and I watched my husband eat the pasta I had cooked. Watched him wipe his mouth with a paper napkin. Watched him scroll his phone under the table, thinking I couldn't see, and I thought, am I wrong? Am I imagining this? Over the following 6 weeks, I stopped imagining. There were more receipts. There were texts that flashed on his screen when he forgot to turn it face down. Fragments, not enough to see clearly, but enough to recognize the temperature of something illicit. There was a name, Kayla, a woman 10 years younger, a paralegal at a firm downtown. I found her Instagram by accident, or maybe it wasn't entirely accident. She was beautiful in the uncomplicated way of someone who has not yet had to fight for anything. She posted photos of rooftop bars, weekend brunches, sunsets from hotel windows. One of those hotel windows, I realized, had the same view as the Marriott on Michigan Avenue. I said nothing. I was calculating. I was becoming someone I hadn't known I could be. It was in late April that I found out I was pregnant. I stared at the test in the bathroom of my office building, not our home bathroom, because even in that moment of pure private shock, some instinct told me to keep this separate, to protect it. 2 pink lines. I sat on the closed lid of the toilet for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I timed it. I was terrified. I was also, underneath the terror, deeply, ferociously happy. I told no one. I made an appointment with my OB. I began, quietly and carefully, to make certain arrangements. I had 6 weeks before I was ready to tell Daniel. 6 weeks in which I did things I will describe in time. He found out on a Wednesday evening in early June. I had come home from a doctor's appointment and made the mistake, the small human mistake, of leaving the prenatal vitamin bottle on the bathroom counter. Daniel saw it. He came downstairs slowly, holding the bottle, and the expression on his face was not what I expected. It was not joy. It was not surprise. It was something closer to panic. "Are you pregnant?" he asked. "Yes," I said, 12 weeks. He set the vitamin bottle on the kitchen island. He looked at the window. He looked at his hands. And then he looked at me with an expression I will never forget. Not cruelty exactly, but something worse. The look of a man who has already, in his mind, left the room. "I'm leaving," he said. "I've been seeing someone. I'm going to be with her." He told me he had already moved money from our joint account, $31,000, into a personal account that morning. He said he would have his lawyer contact mine. He said, with the calm of someone who has rehearsed this, "You'll be fine, you're smart, you don't need me." And then, good luck. I stood at the kitchen island and I looked at this man. This man I had built 9 years with. This man whose child was growing inside me. And I smiled. Not because I was fine, because I had spent the last 6 weeks making sure that when this moment came, I would be ready for it. After Daniel left, I stood at the kitchen island for a long time. Chester padded in from the living room, circled my feet, and pressed his warm weight against my leg. Dogs know. They always know before we do. I reached down and touched his ear, and then I stood back up and I looked at the kitchen. The white subway tile I had picked out myself, the pendant lights I had argued for over 3 weekends of Home Depot trips, the copper pot rack Daniel had always hated and never asked me to remove, and I thought, this is mine. All of this was built by me, and he thinks he can walk out of it with $31,000 and a 26-year-old paralegal and call it even. I was afraid. I want to be honest about that because the version of this story people like to tell, where the betrayed woman rises up cool and invincible and untouched, is a lie. I was afraid in the bone-deep way of someone who has just looked down and discovered the floor is gone. I was 12 weeks pregnant. I had a mortgage. I had a dog and a career and a body doing things I hadn't consented to in terms of nausea and exhaustion and sudden, ambushing grief. I sat down on the kitchen floor, right there, back against the cabinet, and I cried. I cried for the marriage I had believed in. I cried for the 9 years of small accommodations and quiet loyalties. I cried for the child who would now grow up with a father who had met the news of its existence with the look of a man inconvenienced. I gave myself 45 minutes. Then I got up, washed my face in the kitchen sink, drank a full glass of water, and sat down at the kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen. Here's what I knew. I was a financial analyst. I had spent over a decade reading numbers, tracking patterns, understanding the architecture of how money moves and where it hides. Daniel knew this about me. What Daniel did not understand, because he had never truly paid attention to who I was beyond the surface of our life together, was that I had already started paying attention to him the moment I found that hotel receipt in March. The $31,000 he had moved that morning was not, as it turned out, the only thing he had tried to move. Over the previous 6 weeks, I had been quietly monitoring our joint accounts. Not in a dramatic spy thriller way, but in the precise, methodical way of someone who reads financial statements for a living. I had noticed withdrawals, small ones at first, 400 here, 600 there. Then larger ones, spread across multiple transactions, timed to look like ordinary expenses. I had documented all of it. Dates, amounts, transaction IDs. I had screenshots. I had printed statements. I had a folder sitting in the locked drawer of my desk at the office that contained everything. What Daniel did not know was that the $31,000 he had moved that morning from our joint account was only a fraction of what we had together. Because 6 weeks ago, 1 week after I found the hotel receipt, 2 weeks before I knew I was pregnant, I had made a quiet, legal, entirely documented decision. I had consulted a financial advisor, a woman named Patricia Shen, whom I trusted, and I had restructured certain personal investments. Nothing hidden, nothing fraudulent, simply organized. Put where they belonged, under my name, protected. I had not known exactly what I was protecting myself from. I had only known that something was wrong, and that I was the only person who was going to protect me. So when Daniel told me he had taken $31,000 and wished me luck, he was operating on incomplete information. He didn't know about the investment accounts. He didn't know about the folder in my desk. He didn't know that I had made an appointment with a divorce attorney named Margaret Calloway for the following Monday, an appointment I had scheduled with grim prescience 3 weeks earlier. I wrote all of this out on my legal pad. Then I wrote out what I needed to do next. First, call Margaret. Move the Monday appointment to Friday if possible. Time matters in divorce proceedings, and Daniel already had a head start I needed to close. Second, call my bank and place an alert on any remaining joint assets. Request documentation of the unauthorized transfer. $31,000 moved without spousal consent during a marriage. That was not, as Daniel seemed to believe, simply his to take. Third, call my sister Rachel in Portland, not to cry, or not only to cry, but because Rachel was a nurse and had navigated her own difficult divorce 4 years ago and would understand, without my having to explain everything from the beginning, what I needed. Fourth, eat something. I was 12 weeks pregnant and I had not eaten since a banana at 7 that morning, and my hands were beginning to shake. I made toast. I called Rachel. I ate standing up, looking out the window at the backyard where Chester was sniffing the perimeter of the fence in his methodical evening way, and I listened to my sister's voice come down the line from Portland and say, "Tell me everything. I'm not going anywhere." And I did. By the time we hung up, an hour and 20 minutes later, I had stopped shaking. I had a list. I had a plan. What I did not yet have, but would by the end of the following week, was proof. Margaret Calloway's office was on the 14th floor of a building on South Wacker, and walking into it on that Friday morning felt like crossing a border into a country I had never wanted to visit. She was in her mid-50s, compact, with the kind of still efficiency that told you she had sat across from a great many people in the worst moments of their lives and had never once flinched. She shook my hand, offered me water, and waited while I opened my bag and placed the folder on her desk. The printed statements, the transaction records, the screenshots. She looked through it without speaking. Then she looked up. "When did you start gathering this?" she asked. 6 weeks ago, I said. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, more like recognition. "You were ahead of him," she said. "I didn't know I was ahead of him," I said. "I was just paying attention." She nodded slowly. "That's the same thing," she said. What Margaret explained to me over the next hour was clarifying in the way that only cold, procedural truth can be clarifying. In the state of Illinois, marital assets are subject to equitable distribution. The $31,000 Daniel had moved unilaterally without my knowledge or consent was not legally his to take. It was an improper dissipation of marital assets, a term that, in the right courtroom, carries significant weight. We would be filing for divorce immediately. We would be requesting a financial affidavit from Daniel and a court order freezing any remaining joint assets pending the proceedings. "He has a lawyer?" Margaret asked. "He said he would," I said. "I don't know if he does yet." "He will by Monday," she said. "Men like this always find a lawyer by Monday." She was right. On Saturday morning, 2 days after Daniel had walked out of our kitchen, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman's name, Kayla Simmons. "I think we need to talk," it said, "for everyone's sake." I stared at the text for a long time. For everyone's sake. As if she had a stake in this. As if she were a reasonable party to a negotiation and not the woman who had been sleeping with my husband in Marriott hotel rooms while I was at home sorting his laundry. I did not respond. Instead, I forwarded the text to Margaret and called her cell, which she had told me to use. "Good," Margaret said when I read it to her. "Don't engage. She's fishing. She wants to know what you know." What did I know? As it turned out, considerably more than either of them suspected. Because on Friday afternoon, while I was waiting for a prescription at the Walgreens 2 blocks from Margaret's office, I had run into a woman named Diane Pruitt. Diane and I had been friendly acquaintances for years through a neighborhood book club I'd attended sporadically. She was chatty and warm, and the kind of person who always knew slightly more about everyone's business than they intended her to know. We exchanged the usual pleasantries. And then Diane, with the guileless certainty of someone who assumes everyone already knows everything, said, "I saw Daniel last week, at Italy. He was with a young woman. They seemed very—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Established." I kept my expression neutral. "Oh?" I said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Diane said, but the way she was showing people something on her phone, a ring, I thought, "Isn't that something?" A ring. I drove home from Walgreens very carefully, both hands on the wheel, because my vision had gone slightly strange at the edges. Not from grief, I want to be clear about that. From anger. From the specific clarifying fury of someone who has just received the piece of information that turns suspicion into fact. Daniel and Kayla were not simply having an affair. They were planning a future. Together. While I was pregnant with his child. That evening, I did something I'm not particularly proud of but will not apologize for. I went to Kayla Simmons' Instagram, which was public, and I began, methodically, to document. There were photos going back 14 months. 14 months of restaurants and weekend trips and hotel lobbies. In several of them, the background was identifiable. A specific bar in River North that Daniel and I had gone to for our 8th anniversary. A hiking trail in Starved Rock that Daniel had told me he'd visited with guys from work. A New Year's Eve photo shot from what appeared to be a hotel balcony with Chicago's skyline blazing behind them. Our New Year's. The one Daniel had told me he'd spent at a work event and come home from at 2 a.m, smelling like champagne and someone else's perfume. I screenshotted everything. I added it to the folder. And then I sent an email to Margaret with the subject line, "Additional documentation." I attached 23 photographs. Then I sat back in my desk chair and I looked at the ceiling of my home office and I thought, there is no version of this where he wins. It was the first time since that Wednesday evening in the kitchen that I felt something other than fear. It was the first time I felt certain. Margaret filed the divorce petition on Monday morning. By Monday afternoon, Daniel had a lawyer, a man named Gary Hecht, who had a reputation for aggressive tactics and a client list that skewed toward men who expected to win. Margaret knew of him. "He's not afraid to make things unpleasant," she told me, which means they're going to try to make things unpleasant. They did not wait long. Tuesday morning, I arrived at my office downtown to find a voicemail from Daniel. His voice was different than it had been in the kitchen, tighter, stripped of the rehearsed calm. He said he knew I had filed. He said his lawyer had advised him that my financial maneuvering, his words, was going to be scrutinized. He said he hoped I understood that I wasn't the only one who could document things. I listened to the voicemail twice. Then I forwarded it to Margaret. Wednesday brought something more direct. I was leaving the parking garage beneath my office building at 6:15 in the evening when I found Daniel standing beside my car. Not threatening, not physically, but present in the way of someone who wants you to know that your movements are not unknown to them. "I just want to talk," he said. "You can talk to Margaret Calloway," I said, and unlocked my car. Claire. My name, in his mouth, in that tone. The tone he used when he thought he could manage me. "You're making this harder than it needs to be. For you. For the baby. I'm willing to be reasonable." "How much of our joint account is reasonable?" I asked. He looked away. "Get away from my car," I said, quietly, calmly. The way Margaret had told me to speak in any direct interaction. No escalation, no emotion, nothing that could be characterized later as erratic or hostile. He stepped back. I got in my car and I drove out of the garage, and I did not let my hands shake until I was 3 blocks away. But the escalation I had not anticipated came not from Daniel, but from Kayla. On Thursday, she called my office, my direct line, which is not publicly listed. She asked for me by name, and when my assistant put her through, there was a brief silence before she spoke, as if she'd prepared a script and momentarily lost her place in it. "I know this is hard," she said, "but I think you need to understand that Daniel and I are serious. We've been together for over a year. He loves me. And I think it would be better for the baby if you and Daniel could reach some kind of agreement without—" "Kayla," I said, "I'm going to ask you not to call me again." "I'm trying to help you," she said. Her voice had the brittle warmth of someone performing reasonableness. "If you push Daniel into a corner, he's going to push back. I've seen it happen, and I don't want that for you. I've seen it happen. As if this were not her first rodeo. As if she had watched other women be discarded by the man she was now planning a future with and had taken notes." "Is that a threat?" I asked. A pause. "Of course not," she said. "I'm just being honest." "I appreciate your honesty," I said. "Please don't call me again." I hung up. I called Margaret. She instructed me to document the call, time, duration, content, and added it to our file. That afternoon, Margaret informed me that Gary Hecht had filed a counter-petition challenging the classification of my pre-protected investments as personal assets. He was arguing that because I had restructured them during the marriage, they should be considered marital property. It was an aggressive move, legally thin but designed to extend the proceedings and drain my resources. "He's trying to make it expensive," Margaret said. "The hope is that you'll settle for less just to make it stop. Then he's going to be disappointed," I said. What Gary Hecht and Daniel did not know, because I had not yet disclosed it per Margaret's strategy, was that the investment restructuring I had done 6 weeks earlier had been conducted with explicit documentation of my personal contributions to those funds, traceable through years of individual earnings records. The argument that they were marital property was going to collapse the moment those records were submitted. But we weren't ready to submit them yet. Timing, Margaret had explained, was a form of strategy. By Friday, I had fought off a parking garage ambush, a call from my husband's girlfriend, a counter-petition from an aggressive attorney, and 14 weeks of pregnancy-related exhaustion that no amount of prenatal vitamins was fully addressing. My sister Rachel flew in from Portland that weekend. She arrived Friday night with a bag of groceries, a very good bottle of sparkling water, and the particular non-performative competence of a woman who has navigated her own crisis and knows exactly what the other person needs and what they don't. We didn't talk about Daniel much. We watched 2 movies. We walked Chester around the block on Saturday morning in the thin June sunshine. She reorganized my refrigerator, which, she informed me, was a disaster. On Sunday, she sat with me in the backyard while I read, and she read, and we didn't have to explain anything to each other. When she left Sunday evening and I was alone again in the kitchen, I felt, for the first time in weeks, like the floor was solid beneath my feet. I was ready for what came next. 2 weeks passed. In the strange suspended time of a contested divorce, 2 weeks is both very long and very short. Long, because each day carries the weight of its own small decisions and tensions. Short, because the legal machinery moves with a bureaucratic slowness that requires patience as a survival skill. I went to work. I attended my prenatal appointments. I walked Chester. I ate, because Margaret had told me that caring for myself was not optional. It was strategic. A pregnant woman who appears composed, employed, and stable is not the same in a courtroom as a pregnant woman who appears undone. I appeared composed. Daniel's first attempt at temptation came through his mother. Sandra Whitfield had always been polite to me in the particular way of women who tolerate their sons' wives without fully accepting them. She called on a Thursday evening, and her voice had the carefully measured warmth of someone who's been asked to make a call she finds distasteful. "Claire, honey," she said, "I hope you're doing well. I hope the baby is doing well." "We're fine," I said. "Thank you for asking." A pause. "I've been speaking with Daniel," she said. "He's going through a very difficult time." I did not say what I was thinking, which was, he left. He took $31,000. He had been with another woman for 14 months. The difficult time is of his own construction. Instead, I said, "I'm sure he is." "He misses you," Sandra said. "He told me he made a mistake. This, I will admit, landed. Not because I believed it, not because any part of me wanted to go back to the man who had stood in our kitchen and told me he didn't need me, but because he made a mistake is a phrase designed to activate the part of a woman that has spent 9 years loving someone, and that part does not disappear overnight simply because it has been betrayed. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said very gently, "Sandra, if Daniel has something to say to me, he can say it through our attorneys. I'm sure you understand." A longer pause. "Of course," she said stiffly. "I just thought—" "I know," I said. "Thank you for calling." I hung up and stood in my kitchen and breathed. Then I called Margaret and told her about the call, because Margaret had instructed me to tell her about all contact, direct or indirect. She was not surprised. "Classic approach," she said. "Send someone emotionally proximate. Create doubt. See if you soften." "I didn't soften," I said. "I know," she said. "That's why you called me." What I needed, I was beginning to understand, was not simply legal support. I needed the kind of sustained, non-judgmental presence that carries a person through the slow middle portion of a crisis. After the shock has worn off and before the resolution arrives, in the long gray stretch where most people collapse. I found it unexpectedly in a prenatal yoga class at a studio in downtown Naperville. I had joined purely for practical reasons. My OB had recommended it for the back pain that had begun developing around week 14. I had not expected to find community there. I was not by nature a person who easily received community, but there was a woman in the class named Simone, mid-30s, a pediatric occupational therapist, 8 months pregnant with her second child, exuding the particular calm of someone who has already been through one enormous physical experience and knows that the body can be trusted. We spoke for the first time after class over paper cups of decaffeinated tea in the studio's small waiting area. She asked how far along I was. I told her 16 weeks. She asked if this was my first. I said yes. She asked gently if I was doing this alone. Not exactly, I said. I'm in the process of a divorce. She did not flinch or offer a pre-packaged expression of sympathy. She simply nodded with the nod of someone recalibrating and said, "That's a lot to carry." "It is," I said. "Is your support system here?" she asked. I thought about Rachel in Portland. I thought about Margaret on the 14th floor of a building on South Wacker. I thought about Chester and his warm, reliable weight against my leg. "It's getting there," I said. Over the following weeks, Simone became part of the architecture of my survival. We texted. We had coffee after class on Thursday mornings. She did not pry into the legal proceedings, and I did not burden her with them. What she offered was simpler: the proof, by her existence, that a woman could go through something hard and come out the other side not merely intact, but genuinely, specifically okay. She also, in one of those unplanned conversations that turns out to be important, mentioned a therapist she had worked with, a woman named Dr. Anita Flores, who specialized in life transitions. I made an appointment. Dr. Flores' office was the opposite of dramatic. Beige walls, a rubber plant, the kind of deliberate quietness that signals a space designed for difficult things. "What do you need right now?" she asked me at the end of our first session. "To get through this," I said, "and to be okay on the other side of it." "Those are the same goals," she said. "Let's start there." And we did. Daniel and Kayla, I knew, were watching, waiting to see if I would crack, waiting to see if the pregnancy, the legal pressure, the isolation would eventually make me tractable. They were watching the wrong woman. They came on a Sunday. I had not expected it, which I realized afterward was exactly the point. Sunday at 11 in the morning, when I was in sweatpants, walking Chester around the block at the particular low-guard hour of a weekend when a person is most herself and least defended. I turned the corner onto my street and saw Daniel's car in front of the house. He was standing by the passenger door, and Kayla was standing beside him. I will give her this. She was exactly as the photographs had suggested, young and well-dressed in the performative way of someone who is prepared carefully for a confrontation she's framed to herself as a peace offering. She was wearing a cream-colored blazer over jeans. Her hair was done. She looked, in short, like someone who wanted to be perceived as reasonable. Daniel looked tired. For the first time since all of this had begun, I could see the cost of his choices in his face. Not remorse, I don't think, not yet, but the specific fatigue of a man managing more than he had anticipated. "We just want to talk," he said. I looked at them both. Chester sat down beside my foot, which he does when he's uncertain about a situation. "You can contact Margaret," I said. "Claire." Kayla's voice was softer than it had been on the phone. She had adjusted her approach, less brittle, more sympathetic. "I know you think I'm the enemy. I understand that, but we're not here to fight. We genuinely want to find a way through this that works for everyone, including the baby. Including the baby. She said it with the practiced ease of someone who has rehearsed how to use the right words, as if the baby were a neutral party in a business negotiation, and not a child whose existence she and Daniel had apparently worked around for 14 months. "What is it you want to say?" I asked. My voice was level. Dr. Flores and I had talked about this, about maintaining the calm center when pressure was being applied from the outside. Daniel spoke. His lawyer had apparently advised him to propose a settlement, a specific number lower than what I was entitled to, framed as generous. In exchange, I would agree to drop the allegation of improper asset dissipation and accept a simplified custody arrangement. He framed it as the kind of thing reasonable adults do. He used the word reasonable 4 times in 3 minutes. "We think," Kayla added, "that a prolonged legal battle isn't good for anyone, especially not someone in your condition. Your condition, meaning pregnant, meaning vulnerable, meaning we believe you are the weaker party here and we are offering you a way out that serves us." I looked at her. I thought about Diane Pruitt at the Walgreens, describing a ring being shown around at Italy. I thought about 14 months of Instagram photographs. I thought about New Year's Eve and champagne and my husband coming home at 2 a.m. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "I want to be clear. I'm not going to settle for less than what I'm legally entitled to. I'm not going to waive the dissipation claim, and I'm not going to modify the custody framework our attorneys are working toward." A beat. Kayla's composure shifted, briefly, just a fraction, and beneath the cream-colored blazer, I could see the person who was actually there, younger than I'd allowed myself to believe, and less certain than she wanted me to think. "Claire," Daniel said, and his voice had changed now too, the management tone dropping away, something harder underneath. "You need to think about what you're doing. Gary is prepared to go very deep into your finances, your pre-protected accounts, your work records. He will make this expensive and slow and brutal, and you'll be doing it pregnant. Is that really what you want?" There it was, the mask down. "Yes," I said. "That's what I want." The silence lasted 4 or 5 seconds, long enough to be a kind of answer in itself. Daniel looked at Kayla. Kayla looked at me. Whatever calculation was happening between them reached its conclusion. "You're making a mistake," Kayla said. But the warmth was gone now. Her voice was flat. "Walk away from my property, please," I said. They got in the car. Daniel started the engine without looking at me again. They drove away. I stood on the sidewalk in front of my house with Chester sitting against my leg, and I watched until the car turned the corner and disappeared. And then, I will be honest, I felt afraid. Not because they had said anything new, but because Daniel's threat about Gary Hecht going very deep was not empty. I knew what prolonged litigation looked like from a financial standpoint. I knew what legal fees at Margaret's rate could cost over 12 or 18 months. I knew that they were betting on my exhaustion, on the weight of the pregnancy, on the simple human truth that wearing someone down can be as effective as defeating them. I went inside. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table. And then, slowly, steadily, the fear turned into something else. It became a kind of fuel. The specific fuel of a person who has been threatened by someone who underestimates them and who has decided with absolute clarity that they will not be underestimated. I picked up my phone and called Margaret. "They came to my house," I said. "I know," she said. "Gary contacted me this afternoon. Are you all right?" "Yes," I said, "and I think it's time to stop waiting." Margaret had been waiting for my signal. We had built the case in layers, the way you build anything structural. Foundation first, then the weight-bearing elements, then the finishing pieces that make the whole thing legible. For 3 months I had gathered, documented, filed, and waited. I had maintained my employment record and my prenatal care and my mortgage payments. I had not been erratic. I had not been emotional in any way that could be documented. I had been, in the language of family court proceedings, exactly the kind of stable, competent, financially responsible party that a judge finds credible. Daniel and Gary Hecht had spent those same 3 months being aggressive. That aggressiveness was also documented. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early September. I was 22 weeks pregnant. The deposition would take place in a conference room at a neutral law office in the Loop. Present would be Margaret and her associate, Gary Hecht, Daniel, and me. Kayla was not invited, though I had no doubt she knew everything. I arrived 11 minutes early. I was wearing a gray wool blazer and black trousers. I had slept 7 hours the night before, which is more than I had slept on most nights since June. I had eaten breakfast. I had made a list on a single index card that I kept in my jacket pocket of the key facts I needed to convey. Not because I was likely to forget them, but because the physical presence of the card was a reminder that I had done the work. Daniel arrived 4 minutes late, which I noted. He looked at me when he sat down across the table, and I think he was searching, in my face, for the version of me he had left, the version who waited and accommodated and said yes, of course, another year. He did not find her. What he found was a woman who was ready. The deposition began procedurally. Gary Hecht was, as advertised, aggressive, not in any way that was inappropriate, but in the targeted, sustained way of an attorney who has decided that pressure is his primary tool. He questioned the investment restructuring. He questioned my employment records. He questioned the prenatal documentation. He was building a narrative in which I was a calculating woman who had premeditated this divorce, who had manipulated marital assets, who was using the pregnancy as leverage. Margaret let him build it. Then, methodically, she began to dismantle it. The employment records he had questioned showed, unambiguously, that the funds I had restructured into personal accounts were traceable, year by year, to my individual income contributions. Money I had earned before and during the marriage, properly documented, properly separated. Not marital assets, my assets. Gary had known this was coming. What he had not known, what I had not disclosed through any pre-deposition communication, was the second piece. Margaret placed a set of documents on the table. Bank records, transaction histories, time-stamped communications. Daniel's $31,000 withdrawal on the morning of June 8th. The preceding pattern of smaller withdrawals across 4 months, totaling an additional $19,400. The hotel receipts, not just the Marriott on Michigan Avenue, but 6 others over 14 months, charged to a credit card issued in Daniel's name, 2 of which appeared during periods when Daniel had represented to me that he was traveling for work. This is a pattern of financial deception conducted in parallel with marital infidelity, Margaret said, which in the state of Illinois is directly relevant to the equitable distribution of assets. Daniel's face had changed. I had watched people receive bad news before. I had watched it happen across conference tables in my professional life. The moment when the numbers on the page stop being abstract and become real. His face did the thing that faces do in that moment, a kind of whitening, a rearrangement. a rapid interior calculation that was visible in the slight movement of his jaw. Gary Hecht leaned over and said something quietly to him. Daniel shook his head once sharply. Then Gary tried his next angle. He questioned the circumstances of my pregnancy. He insinuated, carefully, so carefully in the language of insinuation, that the pregnancy's timing was strategic. This was the moment I had prepared for. I reached into my jacket pocket, not for the index card, for my phone, where I had, per Margaret's instruction, a single document queued, a letter from my OB dated in April, documenting a consultation in which I had discussed fertility and conception. The letter referenced the length of time Daniel and I had been trying to conceive. It had a date. The date was 8 weeks before I found the hotel receipt, 8 weeks before I had any conscious reason to strategize. I was pregnant because I had wanted to be pregnant, in the marriage I had believed in. I placed the phone on the table, face up, and Margaret handed Gary a printed copy. He read it. He set it down. He looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at the table. "Do you need a moment?" Margaret asked Gary with the particular courtesy of someone who has just won. Gary said he did not. But Daniel looked up then. He looked at me across that conference table, and for just a moment, beneath the fatigue and the calculation and the managed presentation of a man who had made choices he was only now fully accounting for, I saw something that might have been shame. I did not feel triumph. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was quieter, more certain. I had known what I was doing for months. He had never known what I was capable of. That asymmetry, that precise documented asymmetry, was the whole of the case. The deposition ended at 12:43 in the afternoon. Margaret and I rode the elevator down to the lobby in silence. When the doors opened onto the marble floor of the building's ground level, she turned to me and said, with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has practiced restraint for 30 years, "That was exactly what we needed." "How long?" I asked. "Gary will advise Daniel to settle," she said. "He's a pragmatic man. He knows when a case is lost." She paused. 2 weeks, I'd guess. Maybe 3. It was 10 days. Daniel's settlement offer arrived through Gary Hecht on a Thursday morning in late September. Margaret called me from her car immediately after receiving it. She told me, been in family law for 27 years, and the offer was not one she would recommend refusing. The house was mine, not as a buyout, as a transfer. Daniel was relinquishing his claim on the primary residence, in part because the alternative was a prolonged court battle over financial misconduct that Gary had finally and accurately characterized to his client as unwinnable. The equity in the house, which we had built over 9 years of dual incomes and one significant renovation project, was substantial. The improper withdrawals, the $31,000 from June, and the additional $19,400 documented across the preceding months were to be repaid in full with interest as part of the settlement. $50,400 and some dollars, give or take, back in my accounts. Child support was set at a figure that reflected Daniel's income and the Illinois guidelines. It was not, as he had apparently hoped, the reduced amount his original settlement proposal had floated. It was what I was entitled to. Margaret had fought for it with the particular ferocity of someone fighting for a child who does not yet have a voice. Custody was structured as primary physical custody to me, with scheduled visitation for Daniel. His rights were not terminated. I had not sought that and would not have, because whatever Daniel was as a husband, I had not yet seen evidence that he would be a bad father, and a child deserves the opportunity to know both parents. What the structure ensured was that I was the primary caregiver, that our child would be raised in the house I had fought for and kept, and that Daniel's access was structured, documented, and subject to review. I signed the agreement on a Tuesday morning. Margaret witnessed it. We shook hands in her office and she said, "You did this, every piece of it." "You built the case," I said. "You built the foundation," she corrected. "I just made sure it held." I walked out of her building on South Wacker and stood on the sidewalk in the September air. Warm still, the way Chicago can be in September before it suddenly isn't. And I was 23 weeks pregnant, and the case was over. And I had won. Not the way the word won sometimes gets used, to mean a feeling of triumph over another person. I want to be precise about what I mean. I had won in the specific sense that everything that was mine remained mine. Everything that had been taken had been returned. The future I was building, alone, now, but by choice and by design, was secure. That evening, I called Rachel in Portland. "It's done," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Are you okay?" "Yes," I said. "Actually, yes." "How do you feel?" I thought about it honestly. I was sitting in the kitchen. My kitchen, in my house, with Chester at my feet and a cup of decaf tea going cold on the table. And outside the window, the neighborhood was doing its ordinary September evening things. A neighbor walking a dog, the distant sound of a kid's bicycle, the streetlight coming on in the early dusk. "Tired," I said, "and ready." "Ready for what?" "Everything else," I said. "And what of Daniel?" He had moved in with Kayla, whose apartment in Lincoln Park was, by all accounts, significantly smaller than the house he had left. I did not track this closely. I had no interest in tracking it. But things have a way of becoming known without active effort. Mutual acquaintances, the small informational ecology of a city. I heard through Simone, who had heard through someone else, that the adjustment had not been entirely smooth, that a man who has spent 9 years in a 4-bedroom colonial finds, in the compressed reality of a 2-bedroom apartment, certain things about himself that had been previously obscured by space. Kayla, I imagined, was learning things about Daniel that I had learned over 9 years. I hoped, genuinely and without malice, that she was prepared for the education. Gary Hecht sent a final itemized bill to Daniel's personal account. Margaret confirmed to me with the dry satisfaction of a practiced professional that Daniel's legal fees had been considerably higher than mine, a consequence of the aggressive posture Gary had maintained until the case became untenable. There was a kind of justice in that. Not poetic justice, real, financial, documented justice. The only person in this story who had behaved consistently, who'd paid attention, gathered information, acted within legal and ethical limits, and never once deviated from the steady, clear-eyed purpose she had set herself, was me. And I was 23 weeks pregnant, and the floor was solid under my feet, and it was time to build what came next. My daughter was born on a Sunday morning in January in the middle of a light snowfall that I watched through the hospital window between contractions, thinking, this is exactly how it should look. Her name is Eleanor Ruth Whitfield Barnes. 7 pounds, 4 ounces, dark hair, and an expression of profound skepticism that made the delivering nurse laugh. Rachel was there. She'd flown in 3 days before the due date and refused to leave until Eleanor was 11 days old, and I had demonstrated that I was capable of surviving on less than 6 hours of sleep and still making rational decisions. The months that followed were the hardest and the best of my life, often simultaneously. Hard because a newborn is relentless in its needs, and doing it primarily alone meant that every decision and every 3 a.m. waking fell to me. Best because Eleanor was simply herself, a small, increasingly alert, increasingly opinionated person who demanded and returned love with an efficiency that reorganized everything. I went back to work at 16 weeks. The settlement's financial provisions gave me stability enough to make that timing my choice rather than a necessity. I found a daycare 2 blocks from my office with a director named Kathy, who could, I rapidly determined, be trusted absolutely. At work, I found something I hadn't expected. I was better at my job than I had been before. Not because the crisis had made me tougher in some cinematic sense, but because having navigated something genuinely complex had recalibrated my relationship with difficulty. Problems that would have felt overwhelming before now felt manageable, solvable. By the time Eleanor was 7 months old, I had been promoted. Simone and I remained each other's closest friends, a friendship built almost entirely in texts exchanged between 2 and 4 in the morning, honest in the way that only exhaustion allows. I continued seeing Dr. Flores. The house began, slowly, to feel less like a battleground and more like what it had always been intended to be, a home. And Daniel, the relationship with Kayla did not survive the first year. Once he was no longer a secret. Once he was, instead, a man in a 2-bedroom apartment with legal fees and child support payments and weekend visitation obligations. The vision she'd built and the man in front of her did not match. She moved out in October. It was not particularly clean. Daniel was in individual therapy, which I thought was probably the most useful thing he had done in years. As a co-parent, he was showing up, on time mostly. Eleanor regarded him with the same skeptical neutrality she directed at most new situations. I did not wish him ill. He had made choices. Those choices had consequences. That was sufficient. What I had was better than his downfall. What I had was Eleanor in the morning, looking up from her crib with the focused intensity of a small person who's decided to be awake. What I had was the house, the kitchen with its subway tile and pendant lights and the copper pot rack Daniel had always hated, filled now with the mess and noise and living warmth of a real life being actually lived. What I had was everything I had fought for. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. Here's what I learned. Pay attention. Document everything. Trust the instinct that tells you something is wrong, and do not wait to be destroyed before you act. The woman who smiled in that kitchen wasn't cold. She was prepared. And preparation. Quiet, methodical, legal, documented preparation is the most powerful thing a person can choose. What would you have done? If this story reached something in you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you're watching all the way to the end, thank you. You are worth telling this to.